Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, and in this video I want to talk about racial reworks and the priority that certain races need in terms of their reworks versus others. Now this is not going to be a list about which races are good, which races are bad, or anything like that. It's going to be a question about like which races need the most attention from Creative Assembly and which races don't. Now, the unknown tab over here, it's going to feature the Greenskins, the Ogres, and Khorne because the next DLC is going to impact all three of these races, and I guess we'll see how these races are going to end up playing after the next DLC. Though if Thrones of Decay is any indication, I think Creative Assembly is going to do a good job, because they did a great job with Empire and Dwarves in particular in Thrones of Decay. Nurgle less so, I would say, but still, Nurgle went from being genuinely one of the worst races in the game to being a pretty decent one. I wouldn't say they're the best, at least in the context of Immortal Empires, but they're in a far, far better state than they were before. So with that in mind, let's talk about the races of Warhammer 3. The Beastmen. I would say the Beastmen are a medium priority in terms of racial reworks. The reason I say that is, while I think the Beastmen are a strong race, I don't think they work very well within the context of Immortal Empires. They worked very well in Warhammer 2, when they were reworked in Warhammer 2, but in Warhammer 3, I think they've been left behind. The unit caps, the fact that they spend one single currency for everything, and that thing is hero capacity, army capacity, Huron Lord Recruit rank, encampment levels. All those kind of things together and unit caps are not a particularly great situation for the Beastmen to deal with. What this really ends up doing for the Beastmen is you end up, if you want to play them in a really strong way, you end up playing the early game relying on Regiment's Renown, on heroes, and then eventually getting really good units. But you're not playing with a lot of the lower tier stuff, like you're just skipping on ahead from that lower tier stuff because it's not worth it to say increase gore capacity when you can increase Minotaur capacity, or using that early dread to get yourself more heroes or higher level lords and heroes. That's a problem. I just don't think that particular system, given the way campaigns work right now in Warhammer 3, that might change if Creative Assembly does make further campaign changes. They made a pretty significant one with the way they changed AI, so we have to wait and see what the future holds with respect to it. But right now, the problem in Warhammer 3 is that it's so focused on the early game that even if a race is good, and don't get me wrong, the Beastmen are a good race from a strength perspective, even if a race is good, they're not particularly great to play from a practical standpoint. This brings me to Bretonnia. I think Bretonnia has a high priority in terms of reworks. The infantry issue in Warhammer 3 for any faction is a problem because of sieges, the way that the campaigns work. Yes, Bretonnia has great cavalry, but that's about it. There are other races with great cavalry. And the thing is, the really good stuff that Bretonnia has, specifically their flying cavalry, which gives them a significant tactical advantage, is something you have to spend a lot of turns to unlock. But that's not really the biggest problem. The biggest problem, beyond their limited roster, is the fact that Bretonnia is not in a great space with regards to their vow system, not in a great space with regards to their research system, not in a great spot with regards to their Legendary Lord campaign. So all of those things would need some fairly substantial improvements, and Bretonnia itself in Warhammer 3 on the map is not a great area of the map. The only reason they avoid being critical is they do have genuine strengths. They have early access to artillery. They have a bunch of hero capacity. They do work. Unlike some other races that are going to be on this list, they do work, but they do absolutely need reworks as well. Then we have the Chaos Dwarves. I'm going to put the Chaos Dwarves in low. Not the lowest, because I think, again, the way campaigns are played, that early game focus right now is kind of hurting the Chaos Dwarves. The Chaos Dwarves are built around the idea of, like, you know, the slow steamroller. The problem is, and this is something that I think people need to understand, when you're playing any campaign on any difficulty, the highest level of challenge is always going to be in the early game. And the Chaos Dwarves are not particularly great in that respect. They have those limits of unit capacity. They have those limits early on in their campaign that does end up hurting them. I love the resource system, but I do think Creative Assembly was too restrained in how they applied. Again, context of Warhammer free campaigns. You look at Troy, you look at Pharaoh, which also use a resource system, is a very different ballgame. I think it was not necessarily the best decision for Creative Assembly to have a race that uses both unit caps and a resource system, because both of them are limiting your recruitment, which means you end up saving a lot of those armaments for good units and you don't bother with the lower tiers of stuff. It's the same problem with Beastmen, not quite to the same level, because Beastmen use one single resource for everything, whereas Chaos Dwarfs do have that greater diversity, and their hero capacity is just for building, so that's a much better situation. But still, I think given the way Warhammer Free's played, that they could use some tweaks at the very least. Not the lowest level, because when I consider the lowest level, I'm talking about races that absolutely need pretty much no changes or very, very limited changes. Then we have the Demon Prince, critical level. Daniel is a horrible campaign, horrible race, horrible faction, just the entire thing that Daniel has, the entire design, the entirety of his design is just terrible. Never worked well. At any point. Didn't work well in the Realms of Chaos campaign, didn't work well in the Immortal Empires campaign. He keeps getting units and stuff, and it's like pointless because he's so awful to play. The way he gains heroes, the way he unlocks units, the way his economy works, the way he doesn't have a research tree, the fact that he can't equip normal items. All of these things end up screwing Daniel so much. It is better in every conceivable way to play a Warriors of Chaos campaign as Be'lakor, who everyone has access to, than to bother with Daniel. It is so terrible. I really think Be'lakor should have been as well a demonic faction, but then Creatives only probably took one look at Demon Prince as like, yeah, that is pretty busted. And that is a problem. It's actually kind of sad, really, when you think about Daniel, like the poster child, like Yuri in the tutorial campaign. Great campaign, but the way it was handled in Immortal Empires and the way it was handled in Realms of Chaos, just not a good situation to deal with. Then we have Dark Elves. I'm going to put Dark Elves as a lowest priority. I honestly don't think Dark Elves need that many changes. Their research tree works, their heroes work, their campaigns could use some reworks, but this is not a list about like Legendary Lord campaigns. Like if I was doing a list like that, it would look very different. I think the biggest problem with Dark Elves are their campaigns, not necessarily the race itself. Like, yeah, they miss some higher tier stuff, like whereas many other races have a lot of good stuff, but it's locked by high tiers. The Dark Elves have the different problem, whereas they have a bunch of really good low tier stuff, easily accessible, great economy, great research, great power, but that scalability problem is an issue in long campaigns. But really, as I said, campaigns in Warhammer Free are very fast-paced when that highest level of challenge. So I think Dark Elves are in a great situation. In every level, really. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about them. I understand why some people may not like them as much as some other races, but when you look at them from a design perspective, they do work. Maybe they're not the most fun for everyone, but they do work on a lot of levels. So it's really hard to argue against that. Dwarves, they work. Like, Creative Assembly knocked it out of the park with regards to the dwarves in Thrones of Decay. They went from being one of the most boring and insufferable races to actually play in the game to being one of the most dynamic and interesting races. Campaign objectives, great in the short term, great in the long term, a system that pushes you to keep doing stuff in the world, and they got the recent edition of the Deeps. If there is anything I would change about Dwarves, it's just minor stuff. I mean, there's campaign-related specific stuff with Vorik and Belegar, to be certain. I think their campaign systems could be improved, but outside of that, it's really hard to complain about the Dwarves. They're in a great spot. Great unit recruitment early on, great hero recruitment, just minor annoyances like gyrocopters having pathfinding issues because there's too many entities per unit. not necessarily the best choice that they could have made over there. And then, you know, the annoyance, if you will, of having to spend one settlement slot on getting access to deeps, which feel redundant because your campaign is over pretty much by the time you actually use that system. But that is so inconsequential compared to every other race on this list. Like, honestly, the dwarves shouldn't be on this list in any way, shape, or form. Then we get to Grand Cafe. I think Grand Cafe is in a high priority list. Let me explain this. Cafe is a strong race. Anyone who argues against that, you should play a Cafe campaign. You steamroll that campaign. Like, if you're playing Xiao Ming, Miao Ying, or even Yan Bo, you unify pretty much all of Cafe within like 20 turns at most. If you're being aggressive, if you know what you're doing. Your economy is strong, not because you generate so much money, but because the system of upkeep with Harmony gives you so much upkeep reduction that it gets ridiculous. So a lot of benefits. Problem is, and I'm sure I speak for a lot of people over here, Cafe is boring as dirt to actually play. Because, again, the early game portion is the essential part of a campaign, especially so for Cafe campaigns because of climate limitations. And so, by the time you actually get access to, you know, the interesting stuff, the flying artillery units, the flying units, the monster units, all of the things that Cafe has, like, it doesn't matter anymore. Your Jade Warriors and Jade Warrior crossbowmen are stronger than the units the vast majority of factions have in the game. Or at worst, they're on par with the units other factions have in the game. And you can recruit them cheaper and maintain them cheaper than the vast majority of factions in the game. Cafe is ridiculous. It's not a roster issue, it's a mechanics issue with Cafe. The way their campaigns ultimately end up playing. So I really think they need an update with regards to those campaign mechanics. Harmony needs an update. Honestly, the Shadows of Change Harmony system wasn't great. The post Shadows of Change Harmony system isn't great. The research tree, there's a bunch of good stuff, but it's like too long and the choices feel, I don't know, redundant because you're so very freaking strong anyway. So what does it matter? Quite a few problems when you add it all up with Cafe in terms of enjoying them. Then we have the High Elves. And I'm going to say it, like, if I were to make a list like this, Bretonnia at least has some level of challenge. I wouldn't put the High Elves in a critical spot. I think that would be ridiculous. They're a strong race. But the problem is, it takes until tier 4 to either unlock or increase the capacity of most of your heroes, or as many good factions have that at tier 3. Their campaigns, like Teclis, could really use a rework in his campaign. But they have a great series of varied campaigns with different mechanics. The problem is it's so dull because in every campaign you're playing Spearmen and Archers. Even with the changes to AI, you don't necessarily want to change that. They have a great roster of units, but the limitation on the research tree, the fact that they take longer than many other races to unlock heroes, which affects variety. The whole influence system for heroes and lords either is redundant because you use the load save character system, or it's a freaking annoyance to deal with. Like, High Elves are a strong race, but I just don't think they're that interesting to play right now. Like, I've played many High Elven campaigns. You curb stomp in every single one of them. It's not really a problem, except to some degree Teclis, but even with Teclis you're in a strong position. It just ends up feeling very samey, because again, in every campaign you want to do the same thing. And compare that to the Dwarves. Like, yeah, in the Dwarves you can get Iron Drakes and Thunderers very early on, but you can get Quarrelers, you can get many other units. You can go Flying Army, you can go Ground-Based Army, you can focus on Artillery, you can focus on Infantry. High Elves have one game plan, and I think one of the problems is a lot of the things that would give you army variety are, one, either too expensive compared to the benefit you're getting in battle, because you can have one army of Sisters of Avalon, or you can have 3 armies, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but you can have a lot more armies of Spearmen and Archers with light armor, or just Archers. There's a discussion on that. Like, some people even argue that it's not even worth recruiting Archers with light armor in a High Elven campaign. You just spam Spearmen and Archers, regular Archers without light armor. That's the craziness about the High Elves. So that is a bit of a problem. Also, Ulthuan, kind of dull as an area, but crucial in every single High Elven campaign, regardless of who you're playing as. And I don't know, like, I think the mechanics of the race are lowering the enjoyment you can have with them. From my perspective, I think they need something to, like, they need easier access to, like, more interesting units to begin with. They need a reason to recruit those more interesting units beyond AI cheats, and honestly, that's not enough. They need some further systems to improve their campaigns and, you know, just give you a reason to do more than just, like, recruiting archers and spearmen. Or, you know, one army of Shadow Warriors for Elefanar and then archers and spearmen for him as well. And no heroes because you have very limited heroes in your campaign. Great stuff. Kislev. Critical level, absolutely. Like, Kislev has a strong army. Undeniably so. But the entire mechanic of dealing with the supporter system, not great. Astankia's unique system, not great. Dull as dirt. I mean, it's kind of funny. We moved from the supporter mechanic, which is awful, in every other Kislev campaign, to Astankia's bullshit. And that's even worse to deal with, because at least with supporters, you can ignore after a point. With Astankia, you're spending an entire fucking campaign, every single turn after turn after turn, going to a tab, clicking a bunch of buttons, not because you care about any of the benefits, you don't need them, again, strong army, but simply because you want those freaking, you want to spend those essences, spirit essences. So great situation over there, great design, creative assembly. Also, economy is really bad, and the problem with that is, to explain it, imagine building a massive empire as any faction, right? It should feel rewarding. It doesn't feel like that for Kislev, because every single bit of coin that you get is spent building more structures just to get any kind of real economic benefit. Kislev is not great to play. Like, I've played more campaigns as Kislev than anyone else. It's really appealing in a lot of ways from an army perspective, design, you know, art perspective, if you will. But, like, the campaign mechanics, just not great at all. And funnily enough, there are mods, simple mods that fix a lot of these issues. But even then, like, screw the supporter system. And they took that system from Troy. Let me tell you this about the Trojan supporter system. One involved only 2 factions, not 3, to begin with. And it was not really as much of a race and not really something at the way it's in Warhammer 3. Because in Warhammer 3, it's like you have to focus on supporters, right? So all those invocations, like, oh, you just invoke Ursun and you conquer as much territory. You cheese the shit out of it. That's, by the way, the worst part. That the best way to play Kislev, I mean, you can talk about cheesing in every campaign, like, yeah, you can gain a lot of benefits, but in a Kislev campaign, the difference between cheesing and not cheesing is not a fucking thing. And it's like, you will have a much better time overall in a long campaign if you cheese the shit out of the early game, but that's not great. Like, when the game incentivizes you to cheese, like, that's the problem. If you play an Empire campaign or the World campaign and you cheese, yeah, you can gain some advantages, but you don't need to do it. Whereas in a Kislev campaign, you kind of feel you need to do it one way or another, like using the load save character system to bypass the Ice Court training duration, so you have an early game advantage because the early game matters the most. Using diplomacy to gain money because your economy is not generating money. You know, abusing diplomacy to generate supporters in order to achieve your short campaign victory condition faster than it would take your long campaign victory conditions, which, by the way, does happen in the Catherine or Starleton campaign. It can take longer to do your short campaign victory condition than your long campaign victory condition. In fact, you might finish your long campaign victory condition before you finish your short campaign victory condition. I'm quite serious on this because of the way supporters are designed. So lots of things that really need to be changed over there. Lizardmen, yeah, I'm going to say Lizardmen are a high priority. Not the highest priority, far from it. But still, like, how do you take dinosaurs, mounted on dinosaurs, and make that dull? I would like an answer to that. Like, say what you will about Cafe Bretonia High Elves, at least they work. Lizardmen, think of this. They deal with, their campaigns predominantly deal with one climate, jungle. And jungle is awful in Warhammer 3. That's something that needs to be changed. It's awful in every single campaign that deals with jungle predominantly. Like Teclis suffers from it. But and the Lutheran campaign suffer for it, unless you have underweight, which Skaven do. Lizardmen, who are supposed to be masters of jungle, move just as slow as everyone else in the jungle, which is like, okay. So you're saying that the masters of jungle are actually one of the worst races to play in the jungle. I'm serious, because they have limited armies. It takes longer to build with them than many other races. Like the standard build times, they're longer for the Lizardmen. You want to get heroes, you want to recruit heroes, takes longer for Lizardmen, even than the High Elves. Want to get access to her capacity, takes longer for the Lizardmen. Oh, want multiple units? You gotta build special buildings for it. Just not a great system. Like, just a bunch of systems that aren't particularly great. Even in a campaign as Oxyatl, who has a lot of really good stuff and doesn't have to worry about the fucking jungle, and has teleportation around the world, the slow construction times and the awful research tree are still something that do hold that campaign back in a substantial way. It's not critical because at least the Lizardmen can work and are strong enough to get it done, but geez. By the way, yeah, just gonna put it out there. Norska, critical priority. I'm not even gonna talk about it. Like their lord, they only have one lord choice, and they don't even have a proper skill line for that lord. How? Like I'm curious about the decision making over there, but like just a really huge amount of very, very questionable decisions in regards to Norska. Economy is awful. Their entire system of campaigns, their monster hunts are bugged to hell and back. Yeah, there are mods that can fix that, but if you need mods to apply that, and even with mods, Norska is not in a great place. Like, they really need a lot of improvements, because let me tell you what Norska actually is. It's not a Warhammer 2 race translated in Warhammer 3. It's a Warhammer 1 race that has not gotten any substantive improvements since that point. They've tweaked some values around, but Norska needs a complete overhaul of its entire campaign systems to be better. And then we got issues with the army roster. Don't get me started on how limited that army roster is, and how difficult some things are to recruit. So not particularly great. Nurgle. Kind of hard to argue against. I think Nurgle is in a much better spot. I'm not sure if I would put them on low priority. I think there is some more work to be done. I think like climate issues are still a problem. And in some ways, they are a race that can be a lot of fun in a long campaign, but again, a long campaign's not really important in Warhammer 3. Like, it's one thing to have a race that does well in long campaigns, dwarves, but they do very well in short campaigns as well. Nurgle feels limited, slow, and you might say that's iconic to Nurgle. I call that a load of bullshit. We're playing the same game over here on the same map with the same systems. If a race takes 40 turns to get to the same point that another race gets to at 20 turns, that race is not in a good spot. And I'm not talking here about winning the campaign necessarily. I'm talking here things about recruitment, building settlements, the whole plague system. Yeah, it's better. Like, significantly better. But I do think, like, Nurgle kind of got the short end of the stick with Forensic A, which, keeping in mind the state that the Dwarves and Empire were in, and the popularity of those races, I think that was a great decision by CA, but it's just worth pointing out Nurgle still needs some work. Skaven. Where the hell would I put the Skaven? Like, that's, I think, low. Like, really? Just really hard to argue. They have good climate selection, good campaign mechanics, they have their uniqueness. I do think there is some work needed to be done, but honestly, Skaven are in a good spot. Like, if there is a race that you could consider complete that CA hasn't done anything for in Warhammer 3, Skaven would be it. There are, however, some problems. Their reliance, like the fact that everyone hates them and the way that they're so spread apart, you know, that causes some issues. That's one big problem, because you're basically always fighting against the world, and you don't feel like a horde as much as Skaven should be. That's probably one of the things that bothers me the most about them. And it's like, oh, you can recruit Glanorites and Skaven slaves. Yeah, I'm not going to recruit Glanorites and Skaven slaves. I'm going to go all in on the freaking artilleries, flamethrower, ranged units with the Skaven, because that is a much more effective army. I guess that's one of the things that's kind of lacking, is like that horde aspect. I also think they suffer a bit because one of the dynamics that they had to deal with in Warhammer 2 was balancing corruption, but now you can't. Like, it's one thing for corruption to no longer be a pain in the ass to deal with, but when a race is designed around the idea of balancing something and it just doesn't work, yeah. And also the fact that the Skaven economy is reliant on you holding larger provinces creates some annoyances in campaign. Like, that's my point. Like, they need some changes. I think, though, if they got no changes whatsoever, and I'm gonna say this is about the Chaos Dwarfs. Like, I think Chaos Dwarfs do need some changes. I think Skaven don't need any. But it would be very welcome. Like if they change absolutely nothing for the Dark Elves Dwarves, that's perfectly fine. I think it would be a bit disappointing if they change absolutely nothing for a Skaven, though. We'll see if they add tank wall and how that ends up being. Like, if we end Warhammer 3 without the addition of tank wall, I think I speak for a lot of people. I would be extremely disappointed by that. Slaanesh. Oh, yes. So, Slaanesh is one of those races that can be extremely powerful in the campaign map. Can trivialize the campaign because, vassals and, the cultist armies they can spawn. But battle-wise, it's not that they're awful in battle. That's the shocking thing. They're actually a lot of fun to play in battles. Until you deal with the 10th or the 100th siege in a fucking campaign where Slaanesh just plainly sucks. I mean, Warriors of Chaos are a melee-focused army that can easily break down walls and create entry points. That's something Slaanesh needs. The replenishment is genuinely one of the lowest in the entire freaking game. So yeah, not a great situation over there to deal with over there for Slaanesh. Just like, yeah, those 4 races that I put there, there's another one coming in there. But Slaanesh absolutely needs to be more interesting. Because you play as campaign as Nakari, I'm going to tell you, it's fun one time to bash your head against the wall to conquer all fun. It's fun one time to deal with that challenge. After that, it's not fun at all. Because you're doing the same thing again and again. You could always abandon all fun. There's nothing holding you back there. But then you realize you're going to have to fight a lot of battles that you know you're going to win because you have a powerful army. You're going to have to fight them manually. Also, it's an incredibly limiting situation from a campaign recruitment perspective because recruiting Forsaken, recruiting Warriors of Chaos of Slaanesh is like the best thing you can do. But that and every other unit is not as good because they take a lot more damage. And again, your replenishment sucks. So, yeah, Slaanesh just doesn't feel great to play. They have a lot of power in the campaign. They're really fun to play in open battlefield battles in the campaign. But overall, the entire picture is not a great one. And yeah, Slaanesh does need a lot of help. Empire, I'm not going to talk about this, like, right up there next to the dwarves. And you know what? I'm going to say it outright. Like, the Empire is in a great spot. The only things that need to happen with the Empire is Volkmar and Marcus Wolfhard. That's it. Maybe some infantry additions. That's it. Like, they're actually one of the races that has great campaign system as is. The only thing they would need is a couple more units. Melee units, specifically. Ulrich stuff, potentially. Midland. Valten, potentially. Who knows? Maybe we could get that. We could have a DLC Boris, Toddbringer, all that. But outside of that, like, yeah, Empire is in a great spot. Really, really good spot. Tomb Kings. Again, another race that works well. Is strong enough if you endure the early game in the case of the Tomb Kings. Because holy shit is that early game awful. Being limited in army. But their campaigns are awful. Katep, Khalida, Cetra. Just awful campaigns designed. Like, again, we have a race that was designed for Warhammer 2. Where things work differently. Where playing longer campaigns, dozens of turns, was fine. That was the norm. Warhammer 3, again, 20, 30 turns campaign is over. Imagine spending 30 of those turns with 2 armies at most. You kind of understand the problem of the Tomb Kings. Also the way they gain hero capacity, their limitation on research, their limitation on canopic jars. I can go on. But Tomb Kings have a good roster of units, but you're probably not going to use most of that roster in a regular campaign. That's saying a lot. Also, Books of Nagash suck. So, just putting out there. Also, the fact that they need to fight each other, even Katep and Cetra, which is absolutely bananas from a lore perspective, is just as ridiculous. So, lots of things that do need to be changed for the Tomb Kings. Tzeentch. Yeah, I wouldn't say Tzeentch. Tzeentch needs a lot of changes, but they do need some changes, some critical changes. Their economy is awful. Their casualty replenishment has been improved, but their entire campaign plan is dull as dirt. Like, that's the problem. Like, their economy is limiting. But even if you play the Changeling who doesn't have to worry about that issue and has much better replenishment off the gate, their replenishment is weird. It's so dull. Again, it's even worse than Sinnelleos. Sinnelleos at least has some units that you need to know how to use in order to not get obliterated in battle, because you have to do flanking, maneuvering, all that. Siege is like point and click and win, more or less. Zangors, Forsaken of Siege, Warriors of Chaos of Siege, Chosen of Siege, every single unit having a freaking barrier, annoyances or replenishment with that. And two of the worst campaigns in the freaking game, in both Kairos and the Changeling. And even if you move their positions, the systems, the economic system, the fact that, yeah, you can have a good economy, what that requires is getting a province, building a lot of structures in that province that just increase the economic percent. It's one thing for Skaven to have a bunch of buildings that generate very little income but add up because of, one building in a provincial capital. It's another thing for Siege, who has to build one in every single minor settlement. It limits your recruitment, it further pushes you towards a limited system. And the Changeling, a nothing campaign. A troll campaign, literally a troll campaign, where you fuck around and have no impact on the world. Let me tell you, the Changeling had a lot of impact on the world. Because all the schemes don't mean zilch on Legendary difficulty, or any real difficulty, because the AI just obliterates any rogue army or anything like that. Oh, you started a civil war in the Empire. Doesn't matter. Like, I understand what they were trying to do with the Changeling. I appreciate the intent. It didn't work out, suffice to say. And funnily enough, the whole screwing around factions with diplomacy, you can actually do that with the regular diplomacy better than the schemes of the Changeling, and they're not bugged. The regular diplomacy works. The Changeling schemes, when they don't bug out, are inferior, but they do bug out a lot. Then we have, so how do I want to make this list? So let's put on the furthest left the ones that would need the highest priority, furthest right the lowest from my perspective. So I'm going to put Tomb Kings right next to Lizardmen, yeah, Nurgle Hire, all that. None of these guys need any changes whatsoever, but yeah. Let's go with that. So who do I think? It's kind of weird. Like, it's kind of like picking which one needs the most is like, they're all awful. Except, like, I would say, like, Norska and Kislev are in a better spot, but still they're pretty bad. We're not finished. Vampire Coast. Oof. Playing a faction with limited mechanics, built for Warhammer 2, where limited armies were okay, but they're not okay. Over here, almost a know-nothing economy, complete systems of recruitment, and hero capacity that don't mesh well with the campaign context of Warhammer 3. Yeah, that is the Vampire Coast in a nutshell. Their army is shit. And I might say, oh, but it's a disposable army. Yeah, Skaven slaves and clan rats are disposable. Those vampires, they're not quite the same. And here's the problem. They don't work as disposable units. Regular zombies from the vampire counts are disposable units. You don't give a shit about them because you can recruit them very easily, which you don't necessarily have the same situation. My God, is limited economy for Vampire Coast. But here's the other thing. They actually survive these decent length of time in battle with the vampire counts. Various effects, lord effects, research, etc. That's not something that works. Oh, don't get me started on the research tree. Complete misery of a research tree over there for Vampire Coast. Again, it's a race that was designed for one particular area, didn't make the transition well. This is not something you necessarily can blame on CA alone. And why do I say that? Well, the Vampire Coast has a lot of units that have low leadership, low survivability. And it's that low leadership, by the way, that's the problem. It's not just the fact that they take a lot of damage very quickly. It's also that they'll completely lose their army and all of them disintegrate. But from what I've been told many times over, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but a lot of people have commented on my videos on this subject. So So take it to the grain of salt, if you will, but from my understanding, there was a point where Creative Assembly wanted to buff undead units in terms of their leadership, the Vampire Coast specifically. And the multiplayer community revolted. So that's how you get crap leadership, crap survivability units. Now, the units are one thing, but it's also the problem of the campaign systems. Consider the Vampire Coast versus Counts. The Coast, you can't maintain a lot of armies. Good luck trying. You'll run out of money very quickly. Consider the Counts in comparison. Good economy, good systems. You can support dozens of stacks as the Vampire Counts of trash tier stuff. They're trash tier, but it's fine. That is not workable for the Coast. That's the problem. That's one of the fundamental problems. Never mind the fact that the Vampire Counts have better armies in general than the Coast. So that's an issue. And much better campaign systems. Then we get to the Vampire Counts. I'd say low priority. Let me put it like this. I'd say low priority. This is an interesting one. Because on one hand, I do understand why a lot of people would want the Vampire Counts reworked. But I don't think they need a rework as much as they need more stuff. You know, units, unique systems for individual campaigns, more campaigns, all that. You know, that's fine. But in terms of how their campaigns work, they work well in diplomacy, they work well on the campaign map, they have a lot of economic powers. Maybe they need a couple more buildings here and there, but you can't complain about the Vampire Counts. They're in a strong position. They're fun to play. They have great army variety. They could use different, more playstyles. Sure, I understand that, but it's hard to complain about a lot of things. They could use some improvements, but yeah, really strong race. Really, really good race. Really well designed. And it's surprising because they've only got one DLC, and that was a unit pack in Warhammer 1. That's it. Think of that. Out of all the races on this list, how many of these races have withstood the test of time with absolutely no DLC that has improved their, racial design? Sure, they got some benefits of blood kisses when Coast came out, but that was for a different race in a separate DLC. But a dedicated DLC, we haven't gotten that for Vampire Counts, and yet they have always remained relevant. The only downsides, if you will, are that out of quote-unquote 4 campaigns really free, 2 of them are boring as dirt. Like Manfred's campaign is awful, and Gorst's campaign is dull as dirt. So that is a problem. I understand that issue. But Vlad's campaign, like if you consider Vlad's campaign, I mean, okay, you also have Kemmler, which I keep forgetting about. Surprisingly, Kemmler and Vlad, very different campaigns, but very fun campaigns as well. To play, though I think, like most people, we sometimes forget that Kemmler exists. I certainly did just a moment ago. Anyway, Vampire Counts, really well designed in a lot of ways. Even though in some ways their design feels dated, and it certainly does, but it does work. And the unit variety, because of the raise end mechanic, which scales based on how many enemies you killed, which means on higher difficulties you get even a greater variety, which is actually a problem to deal with when you're playing on high difficulty levels, because you want to get it over as quickly as possible so you don't get swarmed by enemies. That's one of the reasons campaigns don't last as long. But even on those difficulties, you can recruit the highest tier units very early in a campaign. You have to worry about the economy, but I love having to deal with that balancing act. So, just a great situation. Warriors of Chaos, look, I'm going to say it. They're a strong race, absolutely. But they also are maybe a bit too strong as a race, so I'm going to put them in medium. In a way that the recent AI changes have helped alleviate some of that, because it does mean that you're dealing with more tougher opponents, but even so, like, the whole vassal system, the way you can abuse that breaks the game, makes things less interesting, I think. Though, don't get me wrong, they have great systems. The warband upgrade system, I think, should be standard across the board, and a lot of games, maybe to the same extent, right? Not to the same extent as Warriors Cast, but some level of upgrades, especially when you have variants of the same unit, that would make sense. Like, a unit with a shield, or consider Dwarf Warriors or Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. Why can't we just have an upgrade system for that? I don't know. I feel that we should. That's one of the reasons the Warband Upgrade mod is one of the best mods available in the game. But lots of great campaign system. I just think that without the risk in a campaign, you don't really have an interesting campaign. That's the problem with Warriors Cast. The inherent risk that they have, it's just not there. It's higher with the AI changes, but still not where it needs to be. Like, when was the last time anyone attacked the Dark Fortress when you were playing a Warriors of Cast campaign? Like, say what you will about other races, your settlements do get attacked. As Warriors of Cast, even when you get attacked, which is very rare because you have a layer of defenses due to your vassals. I guess you could make things more interesting if you played without vassals, but that's just basically ignoring the entire campaign system to try and make things more interesting. That does indicate to me that things could need to be better in terms of how the race handles. Don't get me wrong, the fact that they finally made vassals actually useful in a campaign is saying a lot about Warhammer 3. You know, some people have like rose-tinted goggles about like older Total War games. Let me say this bluntly. The diplomacy system we have in Warhammer 3 and the vassal system is the best we've had in the entire series. Vassals were trash in every other Total War game to date, except Warhammer 3. It's not perfect because we suddenly ended up with a significant level of power, but it's much better to deal with than otherwise. And then Wood Elves. I'm going to put the Wood Elves as a high priority because while they don't have the vassal bullshit, they don't need to worry about going out there at all. And they teleport their armies around the world, so who gives a shit? Also, their entire campaign is like, just waste time every single turn. Seriously, the Wood Elves are the masters of the end turn button simulator, so they need improvements. They're strong, they're good, they're dull as dirt. I understand, you know, playing tall versus playing wide, but that doesn't work in Total War, and especially doesn't work when you don't need to do anything out there. Like, oh, rogue army spawn. Yeah, none of those mean dirt. In fact, they're just free experience and money. So, just pointless. Orion, Sisters. Draika's a bit more interesting, just fighting the entirety of Lorem, but even so, just... Wood Elves are strong, very strong, have a great deal of variety in their units, roster, etc. From my perspective, I think they need to work differently. But that's where I stand. Let me know tell me what you guys think about all of this. Which races you want to see reworked, which races you don't think need a rework. I would finish with this particular sentiment. I think it's always fair to say that regardless of how good a race is, you can always improve it. The argument that it doesn't need improvement, that's a load of baloney. That said, there are things that need improvement far more than others. And this is where I stand. I'll see you next time.